All right. Um, let's see. Good morning, guys. um, okay, so some of the topics that we're going into today is postmodernity, Nietzsche's ontology, and then what else? Oh yeah, we just need to talk about all those things. So before I go into Nietzsche's ontology, or like what came to my mind the other day, actually, just sort of incidentally. Um, Before I do that, we can talk about postmodernity. So postmodernity, in my opinion, at least when we look at Derrida and some others, there seems to be this emphasis on maintaining hermeneutical openness. That's what I'm going to call this, hermeneutical openness, right? An interpretation that's open, meaning there is no more certain absolute interpretations. Everything is sort of relative, but we need to maintain its openness. So I think postmodernity essentially, at least hermeneutically, leaves us with the tools to combat bad epistemology. Um, but it doesn't give us the tools to deal with an ontology, if that makes any sense. But I mean, I would say it indirectly helps us with an ontology. It kind of gives an opening for a ground for an ontology that isn't already immersed in a kind of bad epistemology. Um, so just to make what I'm saying a little bit more clear, what I'm saying is that postmodernity alleviates us from falling into bad epistemology. Bad epistemology being absolute truth, certainty, rationality would also kind of fall into, just top-down rationality would also kind of fall into this bad epistemology. Anything that is AA by itself and only AA, you could say bad epistemology. And postmodernity, at least when we look at Derrida, because I only really know Derrida, but I know a little bit of Foucault. They both seem to kind of like stress this apophatic in language. I believe Foucault stresses the apophatic in man. So they both stress a kind of like apophaticness, or a more general apophaticness that isn't necessarily tied to a theology. At least until you start reading Caputo, then you start understanding that Caputo tries to tie in Derrida into a kind of theology. But of course, that is all Caputo. But there is some religious elements in Derrida that Caputo argues for, which I think he does a pretty good job of doing. And then, so yeah, it just helps us have hermeneutical openness. It doesn't really give us, and so why am I so now that I've given that background, I can go to Nietzsche now, where I have to say that I think Nietzsche was already pointing in the right direction about how, and it's really interesting because now I feel like I can read Zarathustra in a different light, in a sense that I feel like Nietzsche is attacking bad epistemology, even though it manifests as a critique against Christianity. Ultimately, I would say it's a critique against Christianity's bad epistemology, but in general, I would say he's basically criticizing bad epistemology. The fact that you claim that you know what good and evil is without really grappling it with your being. And so, and even though we've kind of argued, um, people have argued that this dichotomy between, universal and particular, but I don't think, I think I want to finally move away from that. I know Daniel has, he sort of, he makes several distinctions between, um, what's the difference between generalization and universalism, and so on. But I think the main point, because Nietzsche says something in Zarathustra about how the self is the body. The self is the body. And at first I kept thinking, like, I'm like, oh, I mean, physical body, okay. And that's like the initial kind of like impression and initial interpretation that I got out of Nietzsche when I first encountered that. But then suddenly, when I was thinking about this bad epistemology problem, this problem with knowing, um, I started realizing that Nietzsche stresses a kind of self-knowing that is based in ontology itself. Now, if I could try to explain this, what do I mean? Like, because ontology and epistemology, they both need each other, right? But what I feel like needs to be stressed is that the real work needs to be done in ontology while also while also being very wary of succumbing to a kind of bad epistemology. And so, in order for us to sort of maintain and avoid a bad epistemology, we need postmodernism. So, postmodernism, in my opinion, is that tool to help us maintain from succumbing to a bad epistemology over and over again. But even though postmodernism helps us combat that, again, like I said before, we're kind of left to fend for ourselves when it comes to ontology. But Nietzsche gives a very, at least he attempts to give a very robust example of how can we put ontology first, then epistemology. And this begins when he says that the self is the body. And I can't believe that I didn't grasp that he was actually stressing for ontology first, then epistemology, right? Because the problem that Nietzsche finds in Zarathustra is that people are claiming all these things about good and evil, and yet it's sort of just predicated on a kind of like dogmatic creed. It's predicated on some kind of like socially constructed ethics. So they don't really know, right? And that's the problem with. So they don't really know good and evil, so to speak, according to Nietzsche. So in order for you to know, he actually says very specifically in Zarathustra, that you have to know your particular good and evil. But if you go back to that one line in Zarathustra where he talks about the body, that the self is the body, already you can tell that Nietzsche is pushing us to put ontology first, then epistemology afterwards. So he's already stressing, in my opinion, for a reordering, where the previous mistake was that we had epistemology first, which fed into an ontology, but that epistemology was already bad, which hence logically already gave us a bad ontology out of consequence, which is why, in my opinion, Nietzsche ends up critiquing Christianity, because Christianity, in his opinion, is already predicated on a bad epistemology. They're claiming that they know good and evil when they don't. It's an epistemology that it's saying it's an ontology, but it's not. It's just a bad epistemology. So here, in my opinion, when he stresses the body as the self, I find it really fascinating because I think he's trying to reorder us to having an onto-epistemology, meaning that ontology is first, then epistemology. And that's sort of the better ordering. And I feel like I can argue this when Nietzsche talks about you don't know good and evil, but you have to know good and evil through your particular good and particular evil. It's not enough to claim this sort of goodness and knowledge of goodness and evil when you have no actual participation in that. Basically, you're not actually self-involved, so it's already this critique of bad epistemology is basically a epistemology without being, essentially, without ontology. But ironically, it has kind of fed into a ontology because we haven't grappled with it. So we're already guilty with a kind of bad ontology by the fact that we're already basing ourselves from a bad epistemology. So it definitely made me think how the most important work for today is to constantly prevent a bad epistemology from happening, and then also trying to juggle and figure out like a good ontology for our current time, and what that means. I think you can see here, and I actually argued this on the net with Daniel, because the AI problem, which has obviously been a huge conversation lately. If we take the most extreme example, right? What's the most extreme example with AI? Well, the most extreme example that we can have with AI, for the most part, without our, own physical human annihilation, basically, is that AI eventually just controls the entire epistemic field, meaning like we are no longer the beings that possess knowing as such, right? It's now all left in the hands of the AI. So several people argued a similar line in the net. How AI has a kind of like search function, right? It's very predicated on kind of like knowing. But if we speculate the most advanced AI possible, imitation and everything, and I think Ebert has even talked about how there's this fear. Really, what makes AI problematic is that there seems to be no limit. But that's funny that that's the fear, that there's no limit, because I think this is the part where you can tell that we're beings concerned with epistemology rather than ontology. And I think you can definitely find this anxiety in I don't mind the dog. You can that. So man, I'm losing my thought here. Maybe because it's probably because the dog's in the back just going crazy. But yeah, the ontology that needs to be talked about has to be with a kind of dealing about that anxiety of epistemology, dealing with that epistemology for the that is demanded, basically, with AI. So yeah, I think AI leads us into why we're anxious about epistemology, about knowing, even with AI itself, with knowing about what's going to happen with AI, our fear about our place in the world after AI becomes so advanced. But again, I think that's because we've been so concerned, and by being the original holders of epistemology, and once AI takes over that kind of field, that field of like knowing, it's going to leave us with only with being left, right? And what was wonderful about the net session from yesterday was that basically, Daniel identified that, at this point, we would have to have a kind of faith, a kind of trust that us as human beings, despite the fact that AI would have like a crazy mimic ability or a crazy likeness to us, especially if we start speculating such advanced AI in this factor, we would just ultimately have to result to a kind of confrontation with our own being, and by also confronting the AI with our own being, having faith that we are ultimately still different from the AI, despite its uncanny semblances or uncanny appearances to still act and behave like a human if we really do get to that stage. And of course, I'm entertaining more, hypothetical examples, but I mean, these are the kind of arguments that keep surfacing. It's always this sort of futural, like, not yet with AI, not yet, not yet. But even if we entertain the not yet seriously enough, we can see that ultimately we're going to be left with being. And that's why I think the stress for ontology is now more important than ever, because it seems like, you know, postmodernism has already attacked the notion of certainty, absolute truth, kind of hermeneutical dogmatism, and everything else. It has given us the tools to identify uh, bad epistemology, essentially, but I don't think it gave us the tools to deal with uh, a a good ontology, basically, and what that looks like. The only person that kind of gives us that right now, at least when we is kind of like Nietzsche, when Nietzsche starts stressing, and of course Hegel as well, uh, with a kind of ontology to help us deal with a epistemology that is always uh, kind of open. Um, but I also think that's what, ironically, is going to keep postmodernism alive as well, mainly because of the fact that it's always going to prevent us from having a bad epistemology. It's always going to be there as tools for us to not fall back into the same habits. Um, but once we understand that sort of effort and balance with epistemology, uh, we need to do our work in ontology. Immediately, I start thinking of Tillich's Courage to Be. I think of Martin Buber, who also stretches a kind of ontology as well over epistemology. Uh, I think I think there's even argument to say that Kant was probably uh, in a similar track, but he decided to bar the ontology from us by barring the epistemology, by saying that there's this just sort of unknown that we can't access. Um, what's interesting with Buber, at least, is that Buber kind of takes this Kantian argument and he says, "Fine, um, we can't know it, right? But we can embrace it. We can take it on." And all these kind of words like over against that Buber is translated with, at least in the English translation, is very bodily like in nature. And so already you start to understand that even Buber is trying to stress a kind of ontology before epistemology, before knowing. So I think thinkers like Nietzsche, Buber, all this stressing of like the ontology first, then the epistemology, we can really start to, really think, in my opinion, now a good epistemology. But we need to. That's the thing, though. Like postmodernity, like I said, gives us the tools to tackle bad hermeneutics, bad epistemology, but it doesn't. It only leaves us with an opening to start thinking now ontology. But then not only do we need to think ontology, but after we think ontology, then we need to think a good epistemology that follows afterwards. And of course, we can kind of use the kind of deduction tools that postmodernism has given us, essentially, from their work, essentially, so that we don't have bad epistemology. But yeah, Nietzsche's stress on the body is a self. I think this is already indicative of the fact that he wants to stress an ontology first, then knowing. And I think that this is definitely the right direction. And I think the anxiety over AI definitely proves our unwillingness to let go of the epistemological power that we like having, essentially. We don't like the fact that knowledge, when it's held in a sort of AI, sort of has limitless potential, limitless ability that sort of transcends our own. Which makes me want to go back to an antidote that I said earlier in the net about Thomas Merton's lecture on Martin Buber concerning the fall, the mythology of the fall, where one of the biggest issues or one of the biggest ironies that Martin Buber saw in the fall was that Adam and Eve were already good. They just wanted to know they were good. And so already you can see how ontologically Adam and Eve were good. But the mistake was they wanted to know that they were good. And this already has like the fall in its implicit nature. And you can tell that the fall is definitely something concerning epistemology, in my opinion. It has absolute concern over bad epistemology, where we think epistemology will help us into being. But and this is what's like more complex about it, because we can't deny epistemology. We can't just say ontology always, because in order to do ontology, you would be implying some type of epistemology. But again, because postmodernism gave us the tools to prevent bad epistemology, in my opinion, we can use those tools to now cater the ground for a good ontology and start thinking about this epistemology that we need. So I guess that's why it's better, and I like Daniel's terms on this. He calls it onto-epistemology. This is what we need. This is the work that needs to be done, especially with the concern over AI, because I think AI, like I said before, is just it's anxiety over our epistemological power slipping. But what's ironic about that is you can tell how much stress we've put on knowing, that we have equated knowing with being, and now we feel like we're going to lose our place and grip in the world because AI is just going to take over that spot, and then we're just left with being, and we don't know what to do with that because we haven't really tackled being. We haven't tackled being with the idea that he doesn't know, with the idea that he may never figure out that he'll know. And that's where I think Tillich's powerful book, Courage to Be, kind of comes in as one of the examples of trying to do that. Kierkegaard's Leap of Faith is another example. And Nietzsche, again, all these thinkers, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Tillich, Martin Buber, all these people stress a kind of being before knowing, a kind of methodology or attempt to how to handle our being in the face of no longer having a kind of epistemology, or at least in the face of a bad epistemology, anyways. So I think there's definitely room to discuss all of that. Those questions are way too big for my brain, but yeah, I can at least identify that problem. But I don't think it gets us anywhere too much. But it does kind of point a direction of like which thinkers, and I think Daniel Garner has done a good job on the counter Enlightenment thinkers. I think these thinkers plus Martin Buber and Nietzsche, they will help us think about what to do with coming up with a kind of ontology for our current time. And I think that's what's difficult about thinking about, just in general, because I think the behavior with thinking has this tendency to assimilate things and turn them into the same. I think that's like sort of like the risk with thinking, like, and that's why I keep saying like postmodernity gave us the tools to prevent that assimilation into sameness. Because I think thinking itself kind of naturally tends towards like an assimilation of everything back into the same. And that's like one of the dangers with even attempting to think like a new ontology, because you can fall into a bad epistemology just by even already attempting to think one without knowing the dangers of what thinking does when it attempts to think. So you definitely need a tool or a sort of wariness of the fact that it can fall into there's always the threat, in my opinion, of a bad epistemology like right at bay, always. Because whatever we say is a bad epistemology, of course, we can identify that historically, but like, oh, look at this, blah, 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 blah. But if you look at some of the same features that it has, you can tell how thinking has a kind of tendency towards an assimilation of the same. And that's what makes it so difficult to maintain difference, to maintain otherness. And I think Derrida did a good job, like, identifying how difficult it is to really maintain otherness. And I think there's elements of that in Heidegger, and there's definitely elements of that in Martin Buber, where like maintaining otherness, maintaining difference is like super difficult. And to actually encounter difference is also at least super difficult for Martin Buber specifically. It's not a given that even if you have what you think is a dialogue, in most cases for Buber is not a dialogue. It's still a threat of like the sameness. You're still extracting qualities from the person. You're still experiencing them. So it's still kind of extracting some type of knowledge about the person rather than embracing them as an actual other with no knowing, essentially. So yeah, all these people kind of stress this element of ontology first, then epistemology. Of course, what's ironic about that, right? And this reminds me of Dimitri's argument about the kind of the implicit ethical thing about embodying versus disembodied. Like, we talked about this on the net too, how disembodied, like nobody wants to be disembodied. Dimitri made this argument. He's like, nobody really wants to be disembodied. So we already make it like a kind of ethical thing by saying like, oh, embodied, we'd rather be embodied. So basically Dimitri's saying, of course, it's a given. We want to be embodied. We don't want to be disembodied. Who does really? The problem is, and I think this is basically going to be an example of the argument that I've been saying, how thinking has this tendency to assimilate into sameness and eradicate the otherness, just naturally. I think that's just sort of the natural tendency. Now, I think, of course, it can be argued in so many ways. Is this a sort of biological, cultural evolution that has led us into having a thinking that assimilates into the same? Can we sort of adapt otherwise? Can we make it a more, I don't know, can we evolve ourselves to be more conscious of this fact? Yeah, those are all down for speculation. I'm not, not declaring anything absolute here, but I'm just mainly trying to point to a problem, a main issue. But yeah, I think I talked about everything that I wanted to talk about. So I hope you guys are doing well. I'm about to have spring break. Still have tons of homework to do. That's been killing me. Hasn't given me too much time to think, at least for myself, at least for like my own thinking. But I have been thinking, just unfortunately within the confines of what the school gives me, which has led me to some interesting thoughts. But I'll be willing to see how much it translates into my own thinking. So yeah. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and take care.